I'm really looking forward to this, and I don't want to take much time. The Vice Chancellor is going to speak to us for about 45 minutes, and we'll use the 15 minutes to ask questions and to give our comments. I have my own questions, but as the facilitator of this conversation, I'm not going to abuse the chair. Welcome to everybody. We have about 33 people right now, and we expect more people to join us. I mean, if you have questions, we also have our chat. I mean, you can be writing your comments and asking the questions while the Vice Chancellor is giving his presentations, and they will be responded to at the end. Vice Chancellor, the floor is yours. I mean, the virtual floor is yours.
No, thank you very much, Wongani, for agreeing to facilitate this session. Thank you very much, Rineka, for organizing this session. And I would like to thank all the people for coming. I just want to put it forward that a culture that does not write shall die, because there is no better way of storing people's culture than actually writing. We are living in an era of COVID that is fundamentally changing the world. And Things Fall Apart is an appropriate book because it is a book about a transition, and transition from a pre-colonial era to the colonial era. And like any other transition, there are many things that go wrong, and there are many things that we can draw in order for us to be able to manage this current transition that we are living in, the pre-COVID to the post-COVID world. The book has been written by Chinua Achebe. Chinua Achebe is probably one of the most famous author in the African continent. And the reason why this is generally believed that the reason why he did not win a Nobel Prize was because of a stinging criticism of Joseph Conrad's book, Heart of Darkness, that Chinua Achebe said it was a racist book. Otherwise, he's one of those people whom everybody feels he should have been awarded a Nobel Prize. It was written in 1958, and it is probably the first book in English written on Africa by an African. The books that had been written before then were mainly written by Europeans about Africans. As I was doing a background reading on this, I watched a video where Chinua Achebe was explaining why he decided to write this book. He said at that point, he had read many books, but he couldn't see himself in the books that he was reading. So he felt that he had to create a body of work where he can be able to see himself. Before I get into the story itself, I would like to read for you a poem written by W.B. Yeats. The name of the poem is The Second Coming. We all know about the concept of the second coming. For those of us who come from a Christian tradition, the second coming is a big concept in Christianity about the return of the Messiah. So the poem goes as follows. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosened upon the world. the blood dimmed tide is loosened, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the West are full of passionate intensity, close quote. Of course, it is from this poem of W.B. Yeats that Chinua Achebe got the title of his book, Things Fall Apart. And secondly, this poem actually is quite timely, especially the last part where it says that the best lack all conviction, while the West are full of passionate intensity. Of course, this basically explains why the West, the least talented tend to rise into positions of leadership, while the talented remain silent. So, in fact, when I was doing the background, they say that Chinua Achebe's book has propelled or distributed this poem to the rest of the world than any other piece of writing. You know, if you just go to the Google and type the word "things fall apart," you know, there are lots of hits that come out. That is because of the novel of Chinua Achebe. So this book is set in the part of Nigeria that where the people called the Igbos stay. This part of Nigeria tried to go independent in the 60s. They tried to make it a country called Biafra, and Chinua Achebe does write about that in his later work, but that was unsuccessful. So the story is cast at the turn of the 18th century, at the end of the 18th century, in a village called Umofia. In this village called Umofia, there is the protagonist of this story, Okonkwo. Okonkwo was the son of Unoka. Unoka was not a respected man in Umofia. He owed money to many, many people. He did not do things that were considered masculine, because the culture, the background of the culture at this particular village was very, very masculine. And because of that, Okonkwo was very, very, very ashamed of his father, and he led a life of fear, fearing failure like his father. Of course, Okonkwo tried to cast his own destiny, and I will talk later about his views on destiny. He would try to cast his own destiny by fighting as a wrestler. And he managed to defeat the undefeated champion called the Cat. And that was the beginning of his positive fortunes. Now, because of this, he became wealthy. He managed to marry 3 wives. He had 10 children. And one of these children was Moye, who later on disappointed him greatly because he ended up converting to Christianity. And then he, in this village, Umuoka. One of the members of the village was killed by another member from another village. And according to the traditions of the place, the payment for that was that a young virgin was going to be given to the village of Umofia, and a young boy. And this young boy, when he arrived at Umofia, he was given to the care of Okonkwo. Now, later on, the oracle of a village decided that this young man, his name was Ikemefuna, should be killed. The person who came to deliver this news to Okonkwo was the most distinguished member of the village, a gentleman called Ezendu. And Ezendu told Okonkwo, who had grown to like Ikemefuna, that this boy calls you his father. Don't participate in his killing. And later on, when the deed was going to be done, Okonkwo, fearing that people are going to doubt his abilities, decided to participate in the killing. This man, Okonkwo, was a man who firmly believed in this masculinity. He wanted to please everybody. He had a violent temper. One example is when he beat up one of his wives because he had gone out to paint her hair. But unfortunately, that was during the time of the Peace Week, and he was fined. So this was a man that was always on the wrong, who was a leader of the village, one of the leaders of the village, but he was living on the edge, violating things that were held dear by the villagers, even though in his own conception, he viewed himself as one of the people who are responsible for the preservation of the culture of the village. So one day, Ezendu, the eldest member of the village, died. And then at his funeral, when they were saluting him with gunshots, Okonkwo accidentally killed the son of Ezendu. It was not intentional, it was accidental. According to the rules of the village, that crime was deemed to be a female crime. It was deemed to be a female crime because it was not intentional. And the punishment for a crime like that was that Okonkwo and his family will have to go into exile for 7 years. And the family of the bereaved, the people who have lost the person, will come and burn his homestead. And Okonkwo was exiled, and he went to another village called Mbata. That is where his mother came from. Very important that when a member of a village is exiled, they go to the place where their mothers come from. So when he was there, his mind was about Umofia. He was planning his return back to Umofia. But things started changing. And here at Mbata, the Christians started coming. And at that particular point, and this, by the way, where I come from, which is the part of South Africa called Venda, they never used to accept twins. And that is why, if you go to the part of the world where I come from, you can never tell any twin that you know that is older than 60 years old. You know, it happened until quite late. In this village, in this area of Nigeria also, when twins were born, they will take them to a forest of evil and abandon them there. So when the Christians came to Mbata and Umofia, they were given the land in this forest, which is the forest of evil, where the people who were died dishonorably were left there without proper burial. And the people in the village believed that they are not going to last, because this is the village of, this is the forest of evil. Of course, that is superstitious. And when the Christians were thriving in such an environment, it became a magnet to attract other people. For example, the twins that were not accepted by the community, the Christians will take them and raise them, and nothing seems to be going wrong. And of course, many people converted, including the son of Okonko, Unoka. And of course, to the disappointment of Okonko, to the point that he actually disowned him. So the Christians were thriving. And then towards the end of his exile, Okonko was looking forward to going back to Umofia. He was expecting to be welcomed with fanfare. He was expecting to come back and ultimately take his rightful place as one of the leaders of the village. But unfortunately, Umofia had also changed. The Christians were there. In particular, there was a gentleman called Mr. Brown, who was responsible for the Christian station in that village. And even people who, many people had converted. Initially, the people who converted were the poor people and the people who were not highly regarded in society, and they were thriving as Christians. And this greatly disturbed Okonko. He couldn't understand how people will abandon their culture for this new religion that had come about. In fact, it was not just the new religion that had already come to the village. The colonization had started creeping in. For example, there was a district commission that in the area. So things were changing quite rapidly, and Okonko stood at the crossroads, but was not prepared to abandon his culture and adopt the new culture that has come. So at one stage, some members of Umofia, because decided that they are going to go and ban the church because it is absolutely disrespecting the culture of the place. And then they went, 6 of them, and they banned the church. Ultimately, they were summoned to the district commission and they were arrested. When they went there, they were expecting to be treated as equals, but they were arrested, they were shaven, they were beaten up, and the uprising that Okonkwo and the 5 other men were expecting from the village never materialized. But what the village did was to go and pay for their release. So they were released, and then they came back to the village. At one stage, when the village was having a village meeting, the people from the district commission came, and Okonkwo was seething with anger. The anger of his culture being eaten away by this new religion and colonization. The anger of having been humiliated when he was arrested for burning the church. And then he went and killed one of the officials with a machete. When he did that, everybody in the village was saying, "What? Why did he do that?" He was expecting a different reaction. He was expecting his action to spark a revolt, but it did not. So he went away and hanged himself. According to the culture of, at the time, if somebody hangs himself, they cannot. They obviously have to be left at the. They can't be buried. They have to be left at the forest of evil. And the members of the communities did not want to take him off. And they told one of the officials from the district commission that you will have to take him off. We can pay you because our culture does not allow us to do that. He was obviously a white person, having realized that if he decides to participate in removing somebody who is hanging there, he's going to lose the respect of the natives. Got somebody else to do it. And he started thinking about writing a chapter on this episode on his book, The Pacification of the backward tribes of the Niger Delta. So this is actually the story. It's a complex story about culture. A culture that is not necessarily based on scientific principles as we know it. And all cultures, all societies have had cultures like that. The British has had cultures of superstition. In fact, many people who went to United States because they were being accused of being witches in Europe. Where I studied at the University of Cambridge every year, we always had a bonfire commemorating the burning of witches. This is the same place where the father of science, Isaac Newton, studied. The land of Isaac Newton, almost at the same time as Isaac Newton, was burning people because they were witches. So this concept of superstition is a universal concept, and it is still found even today in all societies. Of course, once superstition is competing with science, and in this book we see that members of the community were realizing that the medicine of the white man is working better than the medicine of the Africans. And because of that, the culture and the religion that was brought by the British was getting more and more people. The second, this new culture that is coming of religion, of Christianity and European domination came up with schooling. People were going to school. There were schools. People were learning how to read and write. And again, this was another attraction that got people to abandon their culture in order to modernize. And Bongani, you will know, because you come from a place where the people who wanted to run away from their cultures actually went there. It used to be called a mission station in Mahlabatin. Again, just indicating how this transition happens. There has to be some force of attraction that, of course, there is coercion through violence, but it is not only the instrument of making people move, abandon their cultures. It is also, there are also some pull factors: education, access to medicine, sophisticated access to sophisticated things like cars and so on and so forth. So this is really the book, the things fall apart. Now, how do we contextualize it to the present time? Because in many ways, this book is timeless. In many ways, this book describes the situation at hand. It describes the transition that we are making as a society towards the fourth industrial revolution. Not everybody is going to make that transition, but those who do not make such a transition will obviously be worse off. I guess the big question that we need to ask ourselves is, how do we make sure that we go with the times? Because times are changing. There is a theory from the German philosophy, the theory of dialectics. And one of the first principles of dialectics is that everything is always changing. It is changing because we are discovering new science. We are discovering new knowledge. And cultures that are not able to absorb the developments that are coming along are going to become oppressed cultures in the future. If the internet is here, how do we absorb it into our culture? What is it even called in isikos? What is an internet in isikos? The fact that we don't even have names for these things is a clear indication that we are not absorbing these things on our own terms. We have to absorb new ways of doing things, but we have to absorb them on our own terms. Because if we do not absorb them on our own terms, then they are going to be one of the instruments that can be used to subdue ourselves. The second thing that we can learn is a lot of violence in this movie, in this book. The beating up of the wife by Okonkwo, which, according to Okonkwo, was acceptable. But according to the culture it was not acceptable if it is done during the peace week. You will agree with me that it should not be acceptable under any circumstances. So masculinity, the role of masculinity in destroying the psychology of men and in the abuse of women. These are things that are still with us today. These are things that we need to tackle. I was reading a story that gender-based violence has actually increased because of COVID. Where are our psychologists to study that so that we can be able to stop that practice once and once for all? The book is really about a masculine culture or the warrior culture, but the culture that in many ways has to be in the past. Certainly the negative aspects of that culture, gender-based violence, must be firmly put into the past. Then, the third thing that it teaches us, and I will go back to one character there, Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown was a missionary. He was accommodating to the culture. He was listening to the indigenous people there and the leaders of the community of Mofia, of Mbata. Of course, he was determined to convert people because he was a priest. He wanted them to abandon their culture. Then he fell sick, and he was replaced by Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith was a person who did not see any form of accommodation between his culture and the culture of the place. And that it was during Mr. Smith that the tensions between the indigenous culture and the culture that was brought by the Christians and the colonialists came into conflict. That ultimately led to the imprisonment of Okonkwo and ultimately to his suicide. Now, Okonkwo in this movie, in this book, seemed to be cursed. It seems after he killed his adopted son, Ikemefuna, things just did not work well for him. He was fined for beating up his wife. He was exiled for 7 years. He was jailed, and he was ultimately committed suicide. His thinking was that working hard and was going to determine his destiny. He was always dreaming about having a bigger farm for yam. Yam, it was supposed to be the king crop of the place. But even with that hard work, he couldn't quite make it, and he ultimately died, a condemned man by his community because he had done something that is abominable by committing suicide. So thank you very much for listening to my take on Things Fall Apart. I enjoyed this book quite greatly. I have read another book that I am going to hopefully talk about towards the end of the month. It was written by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. The book is Purple Hibiscus, which in many ways almost seems to be a part 2 of Things Fall Apart. Because the Purple Hibiscus is a book about the same geographical area of Nigeria, but now after the people have taken the new culture and the new religion almost in a negative fashion. The negativity of that is illustrated in the book, and I hope you're going to come and listen to me because I considered Chimamanda's book part 2 of Things Fall Apart. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vice Chancellor. Colleagues, unfortunately, we cannot clap virtually, otherwise we're going to do that. Oh, I see Sbusiso Zoom is already clapping there.
While people are talking about the questions, I see a comment by Dr. Vukuza, precisely what is in the book. When all else fails, I'm quoting Dr. Vukuza, when all else fails, your mother's home is the only available option. That is actually quite deep. And of course, there is a conversation in the book where Okonkwo was talking about to his uncle, where he asked him, he says, why is that the case? Why is that when you go to exile, you come to your mother's place?
Maybe, Vice Chancellor, while we are looking at other questions, I can raise a couple of questions of my own. I mean, one of the striking things about this novel is that the story that we often focus on, which is the story of missionaries, is only a third. I mean, in fact, it is told in the last third of the book. I mean, in the last 60 pages, actually. The first 2/3 of the book is really about the culture, I mean, in that community there. I mean, we have spoken about some of the aspects of his violent nature, especially violent nature to women. I thought that was quite striking, I mean, because when people talk about Things Fall Apart, they read it in the context of colonialism, and yet that aspect of the novel actually is in the last parts of the book. I mean, it is a profound part of the book, but it's significant that Chinua Achebe only focused on that part in the last section of the book. I mean, the first part is about the life of that village, I mean, in Igboland. That is the first comment. The second comment actually is about missionaries themselves. I mean, it is quite striking to me that missionaries are not portrayed in any strongly negative terms. I mean, if anything, when you read the novel, I mean, the missionaries are portrayed in pretty positive terms. I mean, of course, I mean, things do fall apart. I mean, they fall apart specifically for Okonkwo and perhaps for the community. But actually, missionaries and colonialism in the novel, at least that was my interpretation, are not seen in any particularly negative light. I mean, I would be interested to hear what your view is. I mean, you mentioned the point about medicine, that people started remarking that the Western medicine made them to heal much easier or earlier than traditional medicines. But generally, the missionaries are seen as a force for good in the novel. I mean, not really as a force that leads things to fall apart. So I'll be quite interested to hear what you have to say about that.
I'm going to even expand it beyond just missionaries and talk about religion, the Christian religion. The Christian religion has not been all negative. Sometimes because of many horrible things that have happened, slavery, colonization, sometimes genocide by people who were professing to be Christians, that we tend to think of Christianity as a negative force. Firstly, I need to put it up front that Christianity was in the continent of Africa before it was in Europe, mainland Europe. Before the British got Christianity, it was in Africa. Its founder, Jesus Christ, was a refugee, political refugee in Egypt. If you go to Ethiopia, the Ethiopian Christian Church, which is quite different from the Catholic version of Christianity, is very old. It's older than Islam. It has been around for as long as Christianity, almost as long as Christianity has been around. What are some of the positive aspects of missionary? I think education is probably the obvious one. That education was brought by missionaries. And by the way, this is not only just in Africa. I mean, if you go to the University of Cambridge, that was a mission station. That was a place or University of Oxford. That was a Christian religious institution. Of course, the negative aspect of it is the way it decimated the positive aspects of our culture. The way it took away our identities and expected us to assume names that are not necessarily indigenous to our places, and ultimately dehumanized us, humiliated us by so doing. There is a question here from Taba. African cultures are not friendly with the pen. Is this shortfall going to see our African cultures disappearing? I don't think it's the culture. It's the people. You are the ones who are supposed to go and write, read and write. So if there is a failure in writing, it's not the failure of a culture, it's the failure of individuals. All of us have a responsibility of making sure that we write, we read, and writing begins with reading. So I think that is another question. Somebody asked, what has since happened in the forest of evil? Well, this is a fiction that is based on observations. So I guess Christianity made all those forests of evils and certain superstitions, such as the abandonment of twins if they're born in a family. They all disappeared. Then there is another question. Is the culture static or dynamic? Cultures should be dynamic. If a culture is static, it shall die. Because if things are changing around us, if internet is coming, if artificial intelligence is coming, a static culture will never be able to absorb that. And because consequently, it is going to die. A culture that is really adapted, and I really am impressed by the way it has adapted to Western dominance, is the Japanese culture. If you read about the the Japanese culture during Edo's era, that ultimately ended when Japan realized that the samurai culture, the samurai culture was the culture of the sword, was never going to defeat the culture of the guns. An army that has swords was never going to defeat the army that of guns, you know, and they had to reorganize their society along the best way of defending themselves that were available. And Japan actually succeeded. When you go to Japan, it's a modern state. But when you interact, it is firmly grounded on Confucius, it is grounded on Shinto religion, because what they did was to make it adapt to the changes that were happening around it. Adaptation is the key for the survival of a culture. I saw an interesting thing. Spiwe, he says, I personally feel that Okonkwo failed to adapt to the tide. He was supposed to accept the change, take its positives and merge it with his own traditions. Things do fall apart, but as they do, brand new and better ones arise. Spiwe, I agree with you, but the only part where I don't agree with you is that brand new and better ones do not arise without active intervention. So it's just not natural that when things fall apart, that good things are going to come out of that. Good things are going to come out of things falling apart if you and I think hard about what society do we want to construct after things have fallen apart. The same thing with COVID. COVID, we probably are never going to go past the COVID era. We probably will never have the post-COVID era. So what we do? Is for you and I to sit down and say, how do we construct our culture so that it is not eaten by the COVID, but it survives and thrives? I'll give you just a classic example. One of the cultures that we adopted from the Westerners is the culture of shaking hands when we meet. That is not our culture. In fact, in the part of South Africa where I come from, you don't come closer to the person when you are greeting. You just say "nda" with your hands. Social distancing. So we have to now start thinking about perhaps it's time for us to go back to that and say that when you meet somebody, you don't greet them in this new way of shaking hands, but you can do something that we did in the past. In all our cultures, there was social distancing when you were greeting someone. It was never intimate. You know. You said if we had absorbed these things in our own terms, we would be in a better position. How do we align the current research work, especially engineering work? I think it has to understand our context. Like, for example, if you are doing telecommunication engineering, it is clear that we are never going to be able to dig the ground and have physical connectivity, ADSL type of connectivity. So it will have to be wireless because our conditions are different. And our continent is large. In our continent, you can fit in China, you can fit in India, you can fit in Western Europe, you can fit in North America, and you still will not be able to feel the land mass of the African continent. So we have to align by being confident and understanding who we are, where we are, the issues that confront us. Once we understand those things, our work, whether it is in engineering, specifically for you, will be directed at tackling those problems that are our problems.
There's a question raised by Farai, the sentence that was imposed on Okonkwo for accidentally killing the son of the village noble. And the first person, you remember, who was killed, where they had to go to another village and get the young man, Ikemefuna, as well as the virgin. So it says, wondering why such disparity in corrective measures. I mean, that in the case of Okonkwo, he was sent away for 7 years and returned. And in the case of the person from the outside the village, they had to pay with 2 young people, one Ikemefuna as well as the virgin who was given to a villager there.
Absolutely. No, those were 2 different circumstances. In Okonkwo's case, was an Umofian killing another Umofian. If it is intentional, you are going to have to leave the village permanently. That will be a male. Now I am using missing, filling the gaps that do not that have not been specified. He would have had to leave permanently if a villager kills another villager intentionally. If it is unintentional, accidental, then, and these are 2 people in the same village, then the culprit will have to leave the village for 7 years. This is the female crime. Whereas for Ifemekun, these were different clans. So is somebody from this village killing somebody from another village? So then the payment is, in this case, it was a virgin and a young man who had to be given by the village that has committed a crime to the village where the victim is from.
You mentioned something that was that quite intrigued me about the culture of Christianity coming from Africa. So when the culture is diluted, when do we have the time to look into cultural intelligence of the diluted culture to restore its principles so that we can be able to intervene effectively and efficiently so that our culture restoration, it is how we want to build it, or we will become the subject of the cultural intelligence. How can we effectively intervene in the dilution of cultural intelligence? Thank you.
I think you can. Education is the most important weapon to deal with those issues. You will have to be knowledgeable. You will have to be able to plan how the culture is going to adapt and how you are going to diffuse that adaptation mechanism to the rest of the population. So education is really the key.
Okay, thank you. How do we ensure dilution does not take us off the path that we are working slowly towards? How do we make sure that cultural dilution does not spin out of control?
We have to be vigilant. We have to be vigilant intellectually. We have to be vigilant physically. And we have to be vigilant spiritually. I can't believe I'm using the word spiritual, but I think we have to be vigilant because we know we know what is happening, how the spirits of the African people are being captured by another version of Christianity, not necessarily in the positive manner. We know about these things, the eating of the drinking of petrol and so on and so forth in the name of the spirit. I see Rudy.
Hi, VC, thank you so much. Sorry, I also lost contact earlier. VC, I perhaps not directly related to the issue of culture. I posted a question. Minister Blade, Higher Education, Training and Innovation, mentioned the issue of locally produced chemicals that will be used for testing kits and a variety of COVID solutions, which I found profound because they are African produced solutions for African solutions. I found it so profound, and the whole issue of traditional medicine is sort of side that's on the back burner and is being brought forward to indicate that we'll be using those solutions for our own problems here in Africa. I just want to check your comment.
No, absolutely. I think production, local production, is very, very important. Local production is absolutely quite important, and it has to be embedded in our culture.
Professor, thanks so much. So it's actually quite a nice book, this one. We read it at high school. So, but tell me something now. Here's a particular thing I think that was also raised by Bongani, which I think if you see in terms of the missionaries, part of the thing, if you read, I've read a lot of books in terms of West African writers, is the issue of rise of racism. Part of the missionaries, some of the thing, it was actually perpetuated, so actually by the missionaries. So your comment, what would be your comment in terms of that? So because part of the particular problem, if you're talking about today, all the things fall apart. Part of the particular problem, the root of the particular problem is the issue of the missionaries. If I quote one issue, the issue of racism. So where now, if in Africa, villages were divided between non-Christian and Christians.
This is, I think there's a bit of a contradiction of thoughts on what you just said, especially on the question that was asked by the previous speakers around the issue of cultural intelligence. Culturally, African cultures, we tend to relay the message to whoever may be fit in the family around whatever subject matter that he may be handling in the near future, not necessarily writing it down. For instance, the issue of initiation schools, if the family is the one that has to be doing initiation schools, the knowledge will be passed from one generation to the next, but it will be in a form of a narration. So when we now then talk about education, and yet such kind of people are not the people that are necessarily writers themselves, how then do we start harvesting such kind of an intelligence? Because the previous movie, it actually sent shock waves in the country when that was being narrated. You talked earlier on about the issue of Okonko and his exile. But at the very same time, in some villages, you may see when you enter them that in the cemeteries, you will find that the people that are at the periphery or on the low-lying areas are the people that came as exiled members of the community. But none of those things, for instance, even in my case, I did not even get to learn of that until I was told by somebody when I was accidentally attending a funeral. But then nowhere it's written that information to say those people that you are seeing on the low-lying areas are actually people that have been exiled that came into your community. Tonga people, when they were coming into our community, for instance, they were put in the periphery because they were thinking that when war comes, the first people that should be attacked should be the ones that were actually taking refuge in our village. But none of that is written. And none of that is something that you will find scholars actually commentating on it. It's something that is accidentally, if I were to put it in, even in inverted commas, that gets narrated to a few individuals. Then the question again links back to what the other speakers were raising to say. How then do we start making sure that we tap into that intelligence, but at the very same time, we do not dilute it in such a way that it feeds us? Thank you, Prof.
I will start with the racism one. Yeah, I mean, those are really the reality that in many ways the question of race almost came as a cocktail with religion. And we just need to understand each one of them in its own context. Sometimes it is entangled, sometimes it is de-entangled, but we need to understand it. We need to understand those concepts quite individually. Now, Spiwe, the issue. I mean, you seem to have a very interesting story to tell. I am looking forward to reading your book. Please have a word with Professor Bongani Ngulunga, who obviously has written his own book, the man who founded the ANC that won the Allen Patten Award, because it begins with you writing those stories. It's amazing when I interact with people, they are telling me things that are very valuable that I know are going to die because nobody has bothered to write them down. So thank you very much, colleagues. I really enjoy. I hope you are going to come and listen to me when I do Purple Hibiscus, and also when I do Heart of Darkness, and also when I do the No Violet book. So I'm enjoying this engagement. Bye-bye.
Well, thank you very much, Vice Chancellor, and thank you very much, colleagues, for attending this. In the next few weeks, we are going to read 2 novels by female African writers. The first is going to be No Violet Bulawayo's novel, We Need New Names. No Violet is Zimbabwean. This novel was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 2013. It's considered now an African classic. No Violet, fortunately for us, is at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study. She has been here since February, writing her second novel, which she just finished about 2 weeks ago. And the title of the novel, and we are the very first few people to know about this, is Glory. It's going to be coming out. It was written at the University of Johannesburg in the past few months. So we'll try to get No Violet, which is something that we have never done before, to participate at the next VC reading group while we'll be discussing her novel. And towards the end of the month, we'll then read Chimamanda's famous novel, Purple Hibiscus. I mean, we hope you'll join us. Thank you very much for participating.
Thank you very much.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.